Okay, I got distracted, so I had to move locations. So I'm just going to finish up that chapter. Where we left off, Carrie was drinking the milk. She licked the foam from her lip with her red tongue and laughed. It seemed a long time before the cornbread and the sizzling beef steaks were done, but nothing had ever tasted so good as that juicy beef. And everyone was happy because now there would be milk to drink and perhaps even butter for cornbread. The lowing of the cattle herds was far away again, and the songs of the cowboys were almost too faint to be heard. All those cattle were on the other side of the creek bottoms now in Kansas. Tomorrow, they would slowly go farther on their long way northward toward Fort Dodge, where the soldiers were. So that's the end of that chapter. And then I'm going to read the next chapter, which is called Indian Camp. Day after day, it was hotter than the day before. The wind was hot. As if we came out of an oven, said Ma. The grass was turning yellow. The whole world was rippling green and gold under the blazing sky. At noon, the wind died. No birds sang. Everything was so still that Laura could hear the squirrels chattering in the tree down by the creek. Suddenly, black crows flew overhead, cawing their rough, sharp caws. Then everything went still. Ma said this was midsummer. Pa wondered where the Indians had gone. He said they had left their little camp on the prairie. And one day, he asked Laura and Mary if they would like to see the Indian camp. Laura jumped up and down and clapped her hands, but Ma objected. It's so far, Charles. And in this heat? Pa's blue eyes twinkled. This heat doesn't hurt the Indians and it won't hurt us, he said. Come on, girls. Please, can Jack come too? Laura begged. Pa had taken his gun, but he looked at Laura and he looked at Jack. Then he looked at Ma, and he put his gun up on the pegs again. All right, Laura, he said, I'll take Jack, Caroline, and leave you the gun. So here's a picture of them going off. Jack and Pa and Laura and Mary. And then in the distance, they're walking away from the house in the barn. So the prairie is so flat and wide, you can see everything for so long. Okay. Jack jumped around them, wagging the stump of his tail. As soon as he saw which way they were going, he set off, trotting ahead. Pa came next, and behind him came Mary, and then Laura. Mary kept her sunbonnet on, but Laura let hers dangle down on her back. The ground was hot under their bare feet. The sunshine pierced through their faded dresses and tingled on their arms and backs. The air was really as hot as the air in an oven, and it smelled faintly like baking bread. Pa said the smell came from all the grass seeds parching in the heat. They went farther and farther on the vast prairie. Laura felt smaller and smaller. Even Pa did not seem as big as he really was. At last they went down into the little hollow where the Indians had camped. Jack started up a big rabbit. When it bounded out of the grass, Laura jumped, and Pa said quickly, Let him go, Jack. We have enough meat. So Jack sat down and watched the big rabbit go bounding away down the hollow. Laura and Mary looked around them. They stayed close to Pa. Low bushes grew on the side of the hollow, back brush with sprays of berries, faintly pink, and sumac holding up green cones but showing here and there with a bright red leaf. The goldenrod's plumes were turning gray, and the ox-eyed daisies' yellow petals hung down from the crown centers. All this was hidden in the secret little hollow. From the house, Laura had seen nothing but grass, and now from this hollow, she could not see the house. The prairie seemed to be level, but it was not level. Laura asked Pa if there were lots of hollows on the prairie like this one. He said there were. Are Indians in them? She almost whispered it. He said he didn't know. They might be. She held tight to his hand, and Mary held tight to his other hand, and they looked at the Indians' camp. There were ashes where Indian campfires had been. There were holes in the ground where tent poles had been driven. Bones were scattered where Indian dogs had gnawed them, and along the sides of the hollow, the Indian ponies had bitten the grasses short. Tracks of big moccasins and smaller moccasins were everywhere, and tracks of little bare toes. And over these tracks were tracks of rabbits and tracks of birds and wolf tracks. Pa read the tracks for Mary and Laura. He showed them the tracks of 2 middle-sized moccasin by the edge of the campfire ashes. An Indian woman had squatted there. She wore a leather skirt with fringe. The tiny marks of the fringe were in the dust. The track of her toes inside the moccasin was deeper than the track of her heels because she had leaned forward to stir something in the cooking pot on the fire, Pa explained. Then Pa picked up a smoke-blackened forked stick, and he said that the pot had hung from a stick that laid across the top upright forked sticks. And he showed Mary and Laura how the holes were where the forked sticks had been driven into the ground. Then he told them to look at the bones around the campfire and tell them what they had cooked in that pot. They looked at the bones. Rabbit! And that was right. The bones were rabbit bones. Suddenly Laura shouted, "Look, look!" Something bright and blue glittered in the dust. She picked it up. It was a beautiful blue bead. Laura shouted with joy. Then Mary saw a red bead, and Laura saw a green one, and they forgot everything but the beads. Pa helped them look. They found white beads and brown beads and more red and blue beads. All that afternoon they hunted for beads in the dust in the Indian camp. Now and then Pa walked to the edge of the hollow and looked toward home, and then he came back and helped to hunt for more beads. They all looked all over the ground carefully. When they couldn't find any more, it was almost sunset, and Laura had a handful of beads, and so did Mary. Pa tied them carefully in his handkerchief. Laura's beads in one corner and Mary's beads in the other corner, and then they started for home. The sun was low behind their backs when they came out of the hollow. Home was very far away, and Pa did not have his gun, remember. Mary walked so swiftly that Laura could hardly keep up. She trotted as fast as she could, but the sun sank faster. Home seemed farther and farther away. The prairie seemed larger, and a wind ran over it, whispering something frightening. All the grasses shook as though they were scared. Then Pa turned around, and his blue eyes twinkled at Laura. He said, "Getting tired, little half-pint? It's a long way for little legs." He picked her up, big girl that she was, and he settled her safe against his shoulder. He took Mary by her hand, and they all came home together. Supper was cooking on the fire, Ma was setting the table, and baby Carrie played with little pieces of wood on the floor. Pa tossed the handkerchief to Ma. "I'm later than I meant, Caroline," he said, "but look what the girls found." He took the big milk bucket and went quickly to bring Pet and Patty from their picket lines and to milk the cow. Ma untied the handkerchief and exclaimed at what she found. The beads were even prettier than they had looked at the Indian camp. Laura stirred her beads with her finger and watched them sparkle and shine. "These are mine," she said. Then Mary said, "Carrie can have mine." Ma waited to hear what Laura would say. Laura didn't want to say anything. She wanted to keep those pretty beads. Her chest felt all hot inside, and she wished with all her might that Mary wouldn't always be such a good little girl. But she couldn't let Mary be better than she was. She said slowly, "Carrie can have mine too." "That is very unselfish, good little girl," said Ma. She poured Mary's beads into Mary's hand and Laura's beads into Laura's hand. And then she said she would give them a thread to string them on. The beads would make a pretty necklace for Carrie to wear around her neck. Mary and Laura sat side by side on their bed, and they strung those pretty beads on the thread that Ma gave them. Each wet her end of the thread in her mouth and twisted it tightly. Then Mary put her end of the thread through the small hole in each of the beads, and Laura put her end through her beads, one by one. They didn't say anything. Perhaps Mary felt sweet and good inside, but Laura didn't. When she looked at Mary, she wanted to slap her. She dared not look at Mary again. The beads made a beautiful string. Carrie clapped her hands and laughed when she saw it. Then Ma tied it around Carrie's little neck, and it glittered there. Laura felt a bit better. After all, her beads were not enough beads to make a whole string, and neither were Mary's, but together they made a whole string of beads for Carrie. When Carrie felt the beads on her neck, she grabbed at them. She was so little that she did not know any better than to break the string. So Ma untied it, and she put the beads away until Carrie should be old enough to wear them. And after that, Laura thought of those pretty beads, and she was still naughty enough to want the beads for herself. But it had been a wonderful day. She could always think about that long walk across the prairie and about all they had seen in the Indian camp. And here is Laura and Mary stringing the beads. Okay, I think we can read one more chapter because that ended. The next chapter is Fever and Ague. Ague? Fever and ague. Let's find out what that means. Now blackberries were ripe, and in the hot afternoons, Laura went with Ma to pick them. The big, black, juicy berries hung thick in briar patches in the creek bottoms. Some were in the shade of the trees, and some were in the sun. But the sun was so hot that Laura and Ma stayed in the shade. There were plenty of berries. Deer laid in the shady groves and watched Ma and Laura. Blue jays flew at their sunbonnets and scolded because they were taking the berries. Snakes hurriedly crawled away from them, and in the trees the squirrels woke up and chattered at them. Wherever they went, among the scratchy briars, mosquitoes rose up in buzzing swarms. Mosquitoes were thick on the big ripe berries, sucking the sweet juice, but they liked to bite Laura and Ma as much as they liked to eat the blackberries. Laura's fingers and her mouth were purple with berry juice. Her face and her hands and her bare feet covered with briar patch scratches and mosquito bites. And they were splattered with purple stains too, where she had slapped the mosquitoes. But every day they brought home pails of berries, and Ma spread them in the sun to dry. Every day they ate all the blackberries they wanted, and the next winter they would have dried blackberries to stew. And here's a picture of them. There's Ma. And there's Laura. Mary hardly ever went to pick blackberries. She stayed in the house to mind baby Carrie because she was older. In the daytime, there were only 1 or 2 mosquitoes in the house, but at night, if the wind wasn't blowing hard, mosquitoes came in thick swarms. On still nights, Pa kept piles of damp grass burning all around the house and stable. The damp grass made a smudge of smoke to keep the mosquitoes away, but a good many mosquitoes still came anyway. Pa could not play his fiddle in the evenings because so many mosquitoes bit him. Mr. Edwards did not come visiting after supper anymore because the mosquitoes were so thick at the bottoms. All night, Pet and Patty and the colt and the calf and the cow were stamping and swishing their tails in the stable. And in the morning, Laura's forehead would be speckled with mosquito bites. "This won't last," Pa said. "Fall's not far away, and the first cold winter will settle 'em." Laura did not feel very well. One day she felt cold even in the hot sunshine, and she could not get warm by the fire. Ma asked why she and Mary did not go out to play, and Laura said she didn't feel like playing. She was tired and she ached. Ma stopped her work and asked, "Where do you ache?" Laura didn't exactly know. She said, "I just ache. My legs ache." "I ache too," said Mary. Ma looked at them and said they looked healthy enough, but she said something must be wrong or they wouldn't be so quiet. She pulled up Laura's skirts and petticoats to see where her legs ached, and suddenly Laura shivered all over. She shivered so that her teeth rattled in her mouth. Ma put her hand against Laura's cheek. "You can't be cold. Your face is as hot as fire." Laura felt like crying, but of course she didn't. Only little babies cry. "I'm hot now," she said, "and my back aches." Ma called for Pa, and he came in. "Charles, do look at the girls. I do believe they are sick." "Well, I don't feel any well myself," said Pa. "First I'm hot, and then I'm cold. And then I ache all over. Is that the way you feel, girls? Do your very bones ache?" Mary and Laura said that that was the way they felt. Then Ma and Pa looked a long time at each other, and Ma said, "The place for you girls is bed." It was so queer to be put in bed in the daytime, and Laura was so hot that everything seemed wavering. She held on to Ma's neck while Ma was undressing her, and she begged Ma to tell her what was wrong with her. You'll be all right, don't worry, Ma said cheerfully. Laura crawled into bed and Ma tucked her in. It felt good to be in bed. Ma smoothed her forehead with her cool, soft hands and said, There now, go to sleep. Laura did not exactly go to sleep, but she didn't really wake up again for a long, long time. Strange things seemed to keep happening in a haze. She would see Pa crouching by the fire in the middle of the night. Then suddenly sunshine hurt her eyes, and Ma fed her broth from a spoon. Something dwindled slowly, smaller and smaller, till it was tinier than the tiniest thing. Then slowly it swelled till it was larger than anything it could be. Two voices jabbered fast and faster. Then a slow voice drawled more slowly than Laura could bear. There were no words, only voices. Mary was hot in a bed beside her. Mary threw off the covers, and Laura cried because she was so cold. Then she was burning up again, and Pa's hand shook the cup of water. Water spilled down her neck. The tin cup rattled against her teeth till she could hardly drink. Then Ma tucked in the covers, and Ma's hand burned against Laura's cheek. She heard Pa say, Go to bed, Caroline. Ma said, You're sicker than I am, Charles. Laura opened her eyes and saw bright sunshine, and Mary was sobbing, I want a drink of water, I want a drink of water, I want a drink of water. Jack went back and forth between the big bed and the little bed. Laura saw Pa lying on the floor by the big bed. Jack pawed at Pa and whined. He took hold of Pa's sleeve with his teeth and shook it. Pa's head lifted a little, and he said, I must get up. I must. Caroline and the girls. Then his head fell back, and he lay still. Jack lifted up his nose and howled. Laura tried to get up, but she was too tired. Then she saw Ma's red face looking over the edge of the bed. Mary was all the time crying for water. Ma looked at Mary, and then she looked at Laura, and she whispered, Laura, can you? Yes, Ma, said Laura. This time she got out of the bed, but when she tried to stand up, the floor rocked and she fell down. Jack's tongue lapped and lapped at her face, and he quivered and whined, but he stood still and firm when she took hold of him and sat up against him. She knew she must get water to stop Mary's crying, and she did. She crawled all the way across the floor to the water bucket. There was only a little water in it. She shook so with the cold that she could hardly hold the end of the dipper, but she did get a hold of it. She dipped up some water, and she set it out to cross that enormous floor again. Jack stayed beside her all the way. Mary's eyes didn't open. Her hands held onto the dipper, and her mouth swallowed all the water out of it. Then she stopped crying. The dipper fell on the floor, and Laura crawled under her covers. It was a long time before she began to get warm again. And here's a picture of Laura crawling across the floor. Sometimes she heard Jack sobbing. Sometimes he howled, and she thought he was a wolf, but she was not afraid. She lay burning up and hearing him howl. She heard voices jabbering again, and the slow voice drawling, and she opened her eyes and saw a big black face close above hers. It was coal black, and it was shiny. Its eyes were black and soft. Its teeth shone white in its thick, big mouth. This face smiled, and then a deep voice said softly, "Drink this, little girl." An arm lifted under her shoulders, and a black hand held a cup to her mouth. Laura swallowed a bitter swallow and tried to turn her head away, but the cup followed her mouth, and the mellow, deep voice said again, "Drink it, it will make you well." So Laura swallowed the bitter dose. When she woke up, a big woman was stirring the fire. Laura looked at her carefully, and she was not black. She was tanned like Ma. "I want a drink of water, please," Laura said. The big woman brought it to her at once. The good cold water made Laura feel better. She looked at Mary asleep beside her. She looked at Pa and Ma asleep in the big bed. Jack lay half asleep on the floor. Laura looked again at the big woman and said, "Who are you?" I'm Mrs. Scott, the woman said, smiling. There now, you feel better, don't you? Yes, thank you, Laura said politely. The big woman brought her a cup of hot prairie chicken broth. Drink it up like a good child, she said. Laura drank every drop of the good broth. Now go to sleep, said Mrs. Scott. I'm here to take care of everything until you all are well. Next morning, Laura felt so much better that she wanted to get up. But Mrs. Scott said she must stay in bed until the doctor came. She lay and watched Mrs. Scott tidy the house and give medicine to Ma and Pa and Mary. Then it was Laura's turn. She opened her mouth, and Mrs. Scott poured a dreadful bitterness out of a small folded paper onto Laura's tongue. Laura drank water and swallowed and drank again. She could swallow the powder, but she could not swallow that bitterness. Then the doctor came, and he was the black man. Laura had never seen a black man before, and she could not take her eyes off of Dr. Tan. He was so very black. She would have been afraid of him if she had not liked him so much. He smiled at her with his white teeth. He talked with Pa and Ma and laughed, a rolling, jolly laugh. They all wanted him to stay longer, but he had to hurry away. Mrs. Scott said that all the settlers up and down the creek had fever and ague. There were not enough well people to take care of the sick, and she had been going home. She had been going from house to house, working day and night. It's a wonder you ever lived through it, she said, all of you sick at once. What might have happened if Dr. Tan hadn't found them? She just didn't know. Dr. Tan was a doctor with the Indians. He was on his way north to Independence when he came to Pa's house. It was a strange thing that Jack, who hated strangers and never let one stranger come near the house until Pa or Ma told him to, had gone to meet Dr. Tan and begged him to come. And here you all were, more dead than alive, Mrs. Scott said. Dr. Tan stayed with them a day and a night before Mrs. Scott came. Now he was doctoring all the sick settlers. Mrs. Scott said all the sickness came from eating watermelons. She said, I've said it 100 times. If I have once, the watermelons. What's that? Pa exclaimed. Who's got watermelons? Mrs. Scott said that one of the settlers had planted watermelons in the creek bottoms, and every soul who had eaten one of those watermelons was down sick that very minute. She said she warned them. But no, she said, there was no arguing with them. They would eat those melons, and now they were paying for it. I haven't tasted a good watermelon since Hector was a pup, said Pa. Next day, Pa was out of bed. The next day, Laura was up. Then Ma got up, and then Mary. They were all thin and shaky, but they could take care of themselves. So Mrs. Scott went home. Ma said she didn't know how they could ever thank her. And Mrs. Scott said, Psh, what are neighbors for but to help each other out? Pa's cheeks were hollow, and he walked slowly. Ma often sat down to rest. Laura and Mary did not feel like playing. Every morning they all took those bitter powders. But Ma still smiled her lovely smile, and Pa whistled cheerfully. It's an ill wind that doesn't blow something good, Pa said. He wasn't able to work, so he could make a rocking chair now for Ma. All right, I'm going to show you a picture of Dr. Tan helping them. I thought it was from the mosquitoes, but it seems like maybe it was from watermelon. I'm going to have to look into this. But whatever the medicine was, it must have been some kind of antibiotic that got them better. Okay, so now Pa's going to make a rocking chair for Ma. This is what it looks like when he finishes. Imagine being able to make that. First, he brought some slender willows from the creek bottoms and made the chair in the house. He could stop any time to put wood on the fire or lift the kettle for Ma. First, he made 4 stout legs and braced them with cross pieces. Then he cut thin strips of tough willow skin just under the bark. He wove these strips back and forth over and under until they made a seat for the chair. He split a long, straight sapling down the middle. He pegged one end of the half to the side of the seat and curved it up and over the down, and pegged the other side to the other part of the seat. That made a high curved back to the chair. He braced it firmly, and then he wove thin willow strips across it, up and down, over and under, till they were filled in the chair back. With the other half of the split sapling, Pa made arms for the chair. He curved them from the front of the seat to the chair back, and then he filled them in with woven strips. Last of all, he split a large willow, which had grown in a curve, and turned the chair upside down and pegged the curved pieces to the legs to make the rockers, and the chair was done. They made a celebration. Ma took her apron off and smoothed her smooth brown hair. She pinned her gold pin in front of her collar. Mary tied the string of beads around Carrie's neck. Pa and Laura put Mary's pillow on the chair seat and set Laura's pillow against its back. Over the pillows, Pa spread the quilt from the little bed. Then he took Ma's hand and led her to the chair, and he put baby Carrie in her arms. Ma leaned back into the softness. Her thin cheeks flushed and her eyes sparkled with tears, but her smile was beautiful. The chair rocked gently, and she said, "Oh, Charles, I haven't been so comfortable since I don't know when." Then Pa took his fiddle and played and sang to Ma in the firelight. Ma rocked baby Carrie to sleep, and Mary and Laura sat at their bench and were happy. The very next day, without saying where he was going, Pa rode away on Patty. Ma wondered and wondered where had Pa gone, and when Pa came back, he was balancing a watermelon in front of him on the saddle. He could hardly carry it into the house. He let it fall on the floor, and it dropped down beside it. "I thought I'd never get here," he said. "This watermelon must weigh 40 pounds, and I'm as weak as water. Hand me the butcher knife." "But Charles," said Ma, "you mustn't. Mrs. Scott said." Pa laughed his big, peeling laughter. "Ha, ha, ha, but that's not reasonable. This is a good melon. Why should it have fever and ague? Everybody knows that it comes from breathing the night air." "But this watermelon grew in the night air." "Nonsense," said Pa. "Give me the butcher knife. I'll eat this melon if I knew it would give me the chills and fever anyway." "I do believe you would," said Ma, handing him the knife. It went into the melon with a luscious sound. The green rind split open, and there was bright red inside, flecked with black seeds. The red heart actually looked frosty. Nothing had ever been so tempting as that watermelon on that hot day. Ma would not taste it. She would not let Laura and Mary take one bite. But Pa ate slice after slice after slice until he sighed and said the cow could have the rest. Next day, he had a little chill and a little fever, and Ma blamed it on the watermelon. But next day, she had a chill and a little fever, so that they did not know exactly what had caused their fever and ague. No one in those days knew that it was malaria and that some mosquitoes had given it to people when they bit them. That's what I figured. I knew it must be the mosquitoes. So mosquitoes can still carry malaria and spread malaria, but now we have antibiotics to help with it. But mosquitoes are kind of dangerous still. We're lucky because there aren't that many of them here on the West Coast. But I can imagine what that must have been like in the prairie and by the creek, how many mosquitoes there were there. I'm telling you, it's so exciting. Every single chapter, there's some kind of like life-threatening circumstance. The pioneers were just seriously strong and hardy, and it's unbelievable all the things they survived and all the things they could do, like Pa making that rocking chair. Okay, I'm going to stop here.